Hi, welcome all. You are joining a science briefing called Ask an Expert, Ocean and Coastal Impacts from Wildfires. We are going to give this just a minute here for more folks to join before getting started. Welcome all. We're just letting folks come in before starting this expert briefing in just a moment here. All right, we are going to get started. Welcome everyone to this briefing on ocean and coastal impacts from wildfires. This is a science briefing being put on by the California Ocean Science Trust for the California legislature that is also open to the broader public. My name is Lauren Linsmeyer. I'm a senior science officer at California Ocean Science Trust, or OST, and I will be your MC and moderator. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors of this briefing, State Senator Ben Allen, representing the California Senate District 24, and Assemblymember Jackie Irwin, representing California Assembly District 42, whose districts experienced the devastating Palisades fire back in January. Thank you so much to your offices for supporting this briefing. For those of you who may not know us, OST is a 501c3 nonprofit created by the California legislature 25 years ago to bridge the gap between cutting edge scientific research and sound ocean management in support of accelerating progress towards a healthy ocean and coast. This briefing is brought to you by OST's Legislative Science Services Program, which brings science advice to lawmakers. And we have a really excellent speaker lineup here today. I will be passing it to them very soon. They are going to be offering high-level science perspectives on impacts of wildfires to ocean and coastal processes and health. The research spans wildfire regimes, how they are changing globally, to impacts of past fires and the recent LA fires on California's coastal ecosystems, and the value of rapid response research and long-term monitoring to understand these changes. We are also going to hear some updates on a new Ocean Protection Council funded region-wide monitoring network. And I just wanted to note that this briefing will be focusing on past and current science efforts of studying wildfire impacts, as opposed to providing more of a public health perspective, which is very important to be keeping note of public health and management responses at this time as well. With that, I'm going to be passing it to our speakers and first introducing them. If you'll give me just a moment here, my Google decided to sign me out. But our first speaker is going to be Douglas Hamilton, who is an assistant professor at North Carolina State University. And then we'll be passing it to Dr. Sasha Kramer, who is a postdoc at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And then we've got Dr. Erin Hestir, who is with a professor at UC Merced and also the PI of Kelp Fire. And then finally, Dr. Julie Deniske, who's been the project lead scientist at Scripps Institution of Oceanography for monitoring the recent impacts of the LA fires. With that, I'm going to open it up to Douglas if they would like to turn on their video and camera and get us kicked off with an overview. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and give this talk today. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so I want to start off just by with this question as philosophical question I've placed at the top here, just to give this very top level kind of broad overview. I want everyone to start thinking about the way in which the Earth, the planet in which we all live, is in fact an interconnected system of different components. We have the atmosphere, we have the land, and we have the ocean, and they're all interacting and coupled in various different ways. We know some of these couplings very well. For example, we know about how precipitation couples different components of the system, but also we're learning consistently new things about the way in which the world around us is coupled. One of these things that we're just beginning to learn about, for example, and we're going to talk all about today, is how fire could be coupled to ocean health. And one of the ways in which fire could be impacting the health of our oceans is through this transport and redistribution of nutrients and also potentially toxicants from a fire through the atmosphere in smoke plumes, where it can be carried out over coastal ocean regions and also out into the open ocean. Now, when this smoke lands back onto the ocean surface, these nutrients and potential toxicants are then released into that marine environment where they can have impact on the biota or the phytoplankton that live within these ocean environments with potentially benefits or detrimental impacts. So, what is actually in fire smoke? What is it that we are interested in understanding in terms of this redistribution of particulates from the land through the atmosphere to the ocean? What we're looking at here is a schematic which shows a fire from its inception in a couple of seconds all the way through to when the landscape might recover on the right-hand side, which could potentially take months to years. Now, within the initial fire plume itself, we might be interested, or we are interested, in understanding the release of nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. Anybody here who does their own gardening or grows anything using fertilizer will understand like the importance of nitrogen and phosphorus for growth. But also from the marine perspective, we're also interested in the wide suite of other potential micronutrients. For example, iron is something that we pay a lot of attention to and its redistribution. There's also a lot of things which are being released within a fire, within the plume, that we actually might not be thinking about. Potential toxicants like heavy metals or other micronutrients as well. So we're spending a lot of time trying to understand what's being released within the fire and where that might be being transported to and where it's being deposited. Now, this transport and redistribution of these nutrients doesn't end with the fire itself. For particularly large fires or particularly severe fires, that fire can then remove the vegetation from the landscape. In doing so, it creates an open erodible surface where the soil itself can now also be mobilized into the atmosphere. And that soil also contains nutrients. So there's a legacy impact of the fire on the landscape, which is also potentially increasing this redistribution of nutrients. In fact, actually, recent studies have shown that potentially 1 in 2 large fires, so half of the large fires, are then followed by these large dust events afterwards. So it's a very important component that we are, when we're thinking about the impact of fire on the ocean, we're not thinking just about the fire, but also this legacy impact on the land until the ecosystem has recovered. So I want to highlight this for everybody here, just using one case study. It's become a little bit of a well-studied case study now, and that's the Australian megafire, which happened in the summer of 2019-2020. What you're looking at on the left-hand side is satellite image products. The top one showing the fires themselves in Australia. Now, these fires consumed approximately 21% of the broadleaf forests in Australia. They were absolutely devastating from an ecological point of view on the land. And on the bottom, what we're seeing there in that orange, you're seeing the plume of that transport, that smoke plume, all the way out over the vast expanse of the South Pacific Ocean. Now, at the same time, the satellites were also able to look down onto the ocean, and what they saw was an increase in chlorophyll A, which is linked as a proxy for increase in phytoplankton growth in that particular summer compared to the previous 15 years. rather amazingly, I think, if you look at the total integrated space of this bloom, it comes out to be approximately the same size as Australia itself. This is a massive growth in primary productivity due to the fertilization effect of this nutrients being transported from the fire to the ocean. So what the authors did in this particular paper is then they took that and then they've worked out what the increase in net primary productivity was over that fire season. And that's what we're looking at here in this bottom graph, this bar graph. In blue, you're seeing the climatology. So this is the average amount of net primary productivity that we will see in these boxes for each month of the year. And then in orange, we're looking at that wildfire season for 2019-2020. And you can see that the orange boxes are larger than the blue boxes. In fact, net primary productivity was enhanced by approximately 20% this particular summer compared to what it normally looks like. Now, it's not just net primary productivity that we can look at, but also how carbon might change. So, a small portion of the carbon which is locked up and used in photosynthesis, a small portion of that carbon actually gets sequestered into the ocean depths and is locked away. And so they worked out and calculated what that carbon export might look like, and it got exactly, in fact, the same number. It was about 20% more carbon export was being locked away due to this enhancement in productivity and that carbon being lost to ocean depths compared to the climatological average. And then what I find fascinating here is that then you can do a quick mass balance calculation where you can calculate how much carbon was emitted from the wildfire and how much carbon might have been sequestered due to this enhanced productivity. And when the authors did that, they actually found that those numbers look surprisingly similar. So this is another way in which we're learning about the complexity of the Earth system through changes in the carbon cycle that we had not previously thought about before, that we need to understand all of these wonderful ways in which the Earth is coupled and all of the potential impacts that different perturbations to different parts of the system may be having on other components. If you are also eagle-eyed, you might have noticed that this was a particularly long amount of
Douglas, are you still there? We might have had a bit of a webinar freeze. Okay, I think while Douglas might be reconnecting, maybe we can ask if, oh,
I just
Douglas, are you
dropped
there?
out there.
Okay, no problem. You're back. We'll
Great.
just jump
Yes.
back.
Sometimes the university's web is not so great. Hopefully, okay, there we go. Let's start again. Let's go back in. Sorry about that. Um, okay. So yeah, I was saying that this particular perturbation, this particular amount of chlorophyll and net prime productivity and carbon export was actually going on for longer than the fire itself, and that was to do with this extra amount of nutrients which were being remobilized from the ground due to this soil, which I was showing before in the previous slide. So again, we need to understand the full impact, the legacy impact of the fire, not just the fire itself as but also what might be happening to the landscape to be able to capture the full picture of that coupling between the fire and the ocean. So, unsurprisingly, to understand all of this is going to require a lot of expertise. Like I say, this is a new and exciting avenue for science, and there is more right now, I would say, that we don't know than what we do know. It requires knowledge across all of these wide different topics and require a lot of data. We require modeling, we require experiments, campaigns, but we also require engagement with communities, with social scientists to understand what these impacts might mean. And this is particularly important because we're actually currently within the United Nations decade of ocean science. So ocean health is at the premier forefront of science at the moment. So we really need to start thinking not just about how to do this science, but the way in which we might want to do this science as well. And so finally, what does this mean? How do we then take this knowledge to think about the future and what that might mean, particularly here for us in America? And I just want to finish off my particular intro talk here, but just by examining how fires have been changing over time within America. What we're looking at here is in blue, the number of fire counts from 1985 through to 2023, integrated across all of America, and in red, the total burned area that those fires have consumed. And what you can see over time is that, in fact, the number of fires in America has been declining. The actual counts of fires has been going down as we've been improving fire management practices. However, the total amount of area being burned by fires is increasing with time. So what that's showing us is that we are getting maybe less fires, but we're getting more severe fires. We're getting larger fires. We're getting bigger fires. And that's what we're going to have a couple of examples from the rest of today's talks, what some of those impacts might mean for some of these larger fires. And one way that we can also see this is the increasing suppression costs of these fires with time as we're getting further on and as we're experiencing more of these larger, more severe fires. And these suppression costs aren't including impact costs as well. And so we need to be thinking about that when we're trying to consider the impacts that larger fires may be having on America. So my three key points for the introduction: the Earth is a highly complex system of interconnected parts. It's fascinating and it's beautiful, but changes to one part of that system will have knock-on effects on other parts of the system. And we're only beginning to learn about this particular one, fire, and the way it might be impacting ocean health. And fires can impact ocean health, but there's so much more that we need to do, so much more we need to understand still. And fires are increasing in severity of the USA. So this raises the question, what does this mean for our coastal communities and their economies? And with that, I would just like then to hand off. I believe I'm handing off to Sasha. Am I handing off to Sasha?
Actually, to Erin. That was my
Okay,
mistake.
no worries. So I'm handing off to Dr. Erin Hestir next to carry on the conversation.
Thank you, Douglas, for the introduction. And I'm going to discuss with you a little bit more about how wildfires impact our watersheds and what the follow-on potential consequences are for coastal ecosystems. As mentioned, I'm also the PI of this large project that we nicknamed Kelp Fire, which is funded by NASA and is a very large collaborative project led by many institutions and many very brilliant scientists. And I'm doing my best to represent the work of a very large team. So let's set the stage for how wildfires affect flooding and pollution, which is why a lot of us are here and are concerned. So wildfire, this is a cartoon that was created by the US Geological Survey to help us understand the effects of wildfires on watersheds. And so wildfires remove vegetation and leaf litter, which exposes bare soil in the watershed to rainfall. We also have intense heat during a wildfire that alters the soil properties themselves. It breaks down organic matter and it makes the soils hydrophobic or water hating, meaning they repel water instead of absorbing it. And burned soils become less porous, which reduces their ability to soak up rain. And in California, our rainy season often comes immediately after a wildfire season, often just weeks apart. And when this heavy rainfall happens on a recently burned landscape, our rainwater runs off onto the surface quickly rather than soaking in. And this overland flow can cause very fast moving runoff, which can sweep wildfire ash, sediment, and debris into nearby streams. In extreme cases, this kind of rainfall can also trigger destructive debris flows. After the 2017 Thomas Fire, many of us will remember the Montecito debris flows, which killed 21 people and shut down Highway 101 for more than 2 weeks. These post-fire sediment fluxes can be so large that scientists estimate that they can contribute more than 50% of the total oceanic sediment budget in timescales as short as 1 week. These events, if you can imagine, can also severely degrade water quality. They can clog these formerly clear streams with ash and burned material. They can transport sediment and pollution to our coastal ecosystems. And in urban areas, the problem can worsen because this runoff can contain toxic pollutants, which include concentrations of heavy metals, nutrients, and other pollutants into our waterways. So monitoring is essential to tracking wildfire impacts, and it requires long-term observations from the mountains to the sea. Stream gauges can track the flow of water and water quality by measuring stream discharge, and these gauges can be outfitted with sensors to monitor things like water temperature, turbidity, and the pollutants in our streams. Field sampling can help fill in the gaps where researchers and agency representatives go out into the field and collect water and sediment samples by hand to measure things like suspended sediments and other key pollutants in streams. In coastal waters, we dive in. Boats and scuba divers are often used to assess marine life, kelp forest condition, and nearshore water quality. But challenges remain. This kind of monitoring is labor intensive, and it's often uncoordinated and unevenly distributed along California's coastline. Adding insult to injury, we don't have enough stream gauges in California. California lacks basic monitoring infrastructure like much of the United States does. We don't have nearly enough stream gauges to understand what's happening in our rivers, especially after wildfires. Only 8% of rivers and streams are monitored. A recent UC Berkeley found that over 90% of California's rivers and streams don't have stream gauges, which means that we can't even answer simple questions like, is there more runoff after a fire? And of the gauges that are out there, many of them are inactive. According to the Nature Conservancy, more than half of California's stream gauges are currently inactive. And the system is very fragmented. Stream gauges are run by a patchwork of local, state, and federal agencies. They're using different formats, standards, and databases. And in some cases, the same gauge can show up in multiple systems with different data. There is a plan in place in California, but progress takes time. In 2022, California released a statewide stream gauging plan in response to Senate Bill 19, which identified in particular the Central Coast watersheds as a priority. But building new infrastructure and coordination takes time. So one of the things we're using is technology to help us support but not replace monitoring. Technology is a very powerful tool, but it can't replace the critical need for on-the-ground sampling and long-term infrastructure like stream gauges. Computer models can help us fill in data gaps. By simulating watershed processes, we can estimate stream flow and sediment loads, combining weather data, land cover, and watershed characteristics tested in hydrologic models. Satellites can also offer a big picture view. Remote sensing provides regular large-scale data across land and sea. It gives us insights into things like vegetation type and density, the wildfire burn area and how severe that burn was. It also allows us to study the sea and quantify things like coastal water quality, like turbidity, chlorophyll, and the plankton in the water, as well as help us characterize the kelp forest's extent and condition. So together, models and satellites can help us connect the dots and allow scientists to monitor change over time across wide regions like the state of California. But they always work best when they're paired with real field data. So we want to take a look at how wildfires have affected runoff and sediment transport. And we're going to look at recent fires in coastal draining watersheds in California. And we're going to focus on two major Southern California events: the Thomas Fire, which occurred in Ventura in December of 2017, and the Woolsey Fire, which occurred in Malibu in November of 2018. We've selected these two fires because both of these watersheds did have active stream gauges, giving us a rare chance to compare satellite data in our computer simulations with real in-stream measurements. These fires can help serve as case studies to help us understand how fire reshapes watershed processes and how that change flows downstream to our coastal ecosystems. So, what did we see after the fires? On our left here, we see a series of Sentinel-2 satellite images from the spring before the Woolsey Fire. The Woolsey Fire, which occurred on November 10th, 2018, and we can see the active fire and smoke in the image, as well as an image taken immediately after the fire on November 30th, where we can see the burn scar on the mountains adjacent to the coast. And we can also see a very marked change in the water color along the coastal zone. Our computer simulations showed very clear post-fire impacts. Stream flow or discharge and sediment loads both spiked earlier in the rainy season compared to non-fire years. The sediment loads were elevated following the fires, but the total volumes were similar to other wet years. But what we do see is, again, that wildfire-affected watersheds show those sediment spikes earlier in the rainy season compared to the non-fire years. Satellite imagery also actually helped us detect the first signal. So we observed large and rapid increases in our coastal turbidity immediately following the fire. And other researchers have shown a similar pattern. Studies by Merced and her colleagues at JPL and UCLA found similar turbidity spikes, and they linked them to very sharp increases in fecal coliform bacteria, suggesting a serious impact on water quality and implications for human health. So what does this mean for our kelp forests? California's kelp forests are one of our most iconic and valuable coastal ecosystems. Kelp is a foundation species. It means that it supports biodiversity, and it contributes globally to an estimated $5 billion ecosystem services through things like nitrogen removal and aquaculture support. But kelp thrives under very specific conditions. They need cool, sunlit, and nutrient-rich waters to grow. Life on land requires light and photosynthesis, and kelp requires the same thing. It photosynthesizes, and so it needs clear water to absorb that sunlight from the surface. It's also a very interesting species to study because it's visible from space. Because kelp forms canopies, it can be detected by satellites and drones, making it easier to monitor changes from above. So what have we learned about the wildfire effects on California's kelp forests? We've been using a long-term data set compiled by the Kelp Watch organization, which is using NASA satellites to create a long time series of kelp cover over California's coast. And we can use this long time series to start to understand how these more recent fires may be affecting the trends in kelp cover that we see over time. So if we look at the waters adjacent to Malibu and we look at the long time series of kelp area and we compare that to the recent time series of kelp area occurring after the Woolsey Fire adjacent to the Malibu waters, one of the things we can see is that for the Malibu region, we see a depression in the kelp area and we do not seem to see a recovery. But I want to highlight that California's kelp forests experience a lot of change over time, and that long satellite time series can allow us to start to understand the influences of not just wildfire, but marine heat waves, strong swells, and El Nino events that can cause those major swings in kelp cover. So what we've done is we've calculated, this is data that has been led by Lori Berberian, who's a graduate student at UCLA. And she has calculated a post-fire recovery index where she has taken that long-term mean of kelp cover for a given county, and she's compared it to what the kelp cover is after a wildfire for each of those recent occurring wildfires in our coast. And one of the things we can see is that for some counties, we do see that there are elevated kelp cover after a wildfire, for example, in Humboldt County, but that across many of the counties of California, 1 year after the fire, we seem to see decreased cover from kelp. 2 years post-fire, we do see some decreases in kelp cover that persist. However, in other places, we start to see an increase, which drives home the point that these systems are highly variable and a lot more research and monitoring is needed. So our key takeaways is it is important to remember that wildfire is a natural process in California's landscape. And it is reasonable to assume that our coastal ecosystems are resilient to a certain level of wildfire, much as our terrestrial ecosystems are. But it's an outstanding question to understand how increased fire frequency and intensity that Dr. Hamilton showed us, especially near urban areas, is maybe changing the game. We also know that coastal ecosystems respond differently to wildfire impacts. And so the question remains, are these ecosystems resilient enough to recover, or are we approaching tipping points where we are not going to see these recovery in these kelp forests? Not all environmental changes are caused by wildfires. And so research still needs to be done to separate the effects of wildfire from those that are caused by other stressors to our ecosystems, such as climate change and ocean warming. Finally, fire severity, frequency, and location can influence downstream impacts. And so we still have outstanding questions around how urban expansion and high fire severities affect sediment, pollutants, and coastal water quality, as evidenced by the different responses of the Thomas Fire and the Woolsey Fire. And I'm going to leave you with the statement that long-term monitoring is critical to understanding fire impacts. And I think we all want to ask the question here, what tools and partnerships do we need to monitor watershed to ocean changes more effectively? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sasha, who's going to discuss some of those boats in the water approaches to that monitoring and response.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Erin. Let me get my slides up here. All right, can everybody see my screen okay? Awesome. So, hi, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Sasha Kramer, and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, or MBARI. I'm going to be talking to you today about some work that I conducted while I was a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara, looking specifically at a case study for one coastal wildfire, the Thomas Fire, and thinking about how that wildfire might have impacted some of the smallest organisms in the ocean, our ocean phytoplankton. This work was funded by a number of different sources, and I'll talk a bit about that more, but I just want to acknowledge that support on the right side of the screen. So when we think about the ocean, most of us know that the ocean is full of life, but what you might not know is that most of that life is too small for us to see. I think when we think about ocean life, most people often think about these bigger, charismatic animals that we know, like whales, dolphins, sharks, or fish. But that vast ocean ecosystem and all of those higher levels on the food chain are supported by smaller organisms that are too little for us to see when we look at the ocean with our eyes. So these large whales and dolphins and seabirds that you can see in this image are consuming some tiny ocean animals, the zooplankton. I'm showing you an example of some different types of zooplankton here, although there are many, many different types of zooplankton in the ocean that all look very different from each other and may behave differently. But this is one that you may have heard of before. This is an example of some little copepods or krill. These little tiny zooplankton rely on getting their energy from phytoplankton. So phytoplankton are even smaller than zooplankton. They're microscopic, so we can't see them. And they're making all of their energy from the sun, just like plants on land. And so if you think about a plant on land, it needs sunlight, it needs carbon dioxide. Phytoplankton in the ocean are the same. And these phytoplankton are living everywhere in the sunlit ocean that they have the resources that they need in order to grow. And they're forming the base of our marine food web, in addition to producing a lot of oxygen, which we all know is important for ocean animals, but also for us as humans on land. So phytoplankton are an incredibly important group that we have in the ocean off the coast of California. And if we think about what it looks like for a typical phytoplankton community living in the coastal ocean, you can see there's some land on the side there on the left. And what do they need in order to grow? they need this balance of sunlight and nutrients. So just again, like plants on land, phytoplankton are photosynthesizers. So they're performing this act of photosynthesis, taking photons of light from the sun and turning that into energy. But they also need nutrients, which phytoplankton get from the seawater around them, since that's where they live. Now let's think about what might happen if we have a coastal wildfire in this ecosystem. So we have this disturbance on land, and Douglas and Erin laid some great groundwork for what that might look like in terms of changing the shape of the land and mobilizing some of that carbon or nutrients from the land into the ocean system. The smoke and ash from that fire is also going to decrease the amount of sunlight and the wavelengths of light that are reaching the surface of the ocean. So that will have an impact on phytoplankton because they have less light to use for photosynthesis to make energy and grow. But we also hypothesize that some of that ash that's falling out from the fire or coming in from other sources from land as the land burns will increase the amount of nutrients, these essential things that phytoplankton need to grow, just like fertilizer for a plant. So some of those nutrients that might be coming from the wildfire ash could increase as that ash falls on the ocean. So as scientists, when we're thinking about conducting a study during a coastal wildfire, and we look at this situation where we know that phytoplankton have some basic bottom-up needs in order to grow, sunlight and nutrients, and those two different needs might be affected in the opposite direction during a coastal wildfire. When we were first setting out to conduct this study during the Thomas Fire, we really weren't sure what we might find. Would the decrease in sunlight have a bigger impact on the phytoplankton, or would the potential increase in nutrients actually balance out that decrease in sunlight? And what would we see? Another important thing to note is that there are all different types of phytoplankton in the ocean. So I'm showing you here some cartoons that show these different types of cells, but there are actually thousands of different phytoplankton species, and some of those phytoplankton have different roles in the ecosystem than others. So being able to understand who is where and why is really important for knowing how the rest of the ecosystem might respond. So Erin talked to you a bit about some of the challenges of conducting field work during a wildfire. The results that I'm going to talk to you about today were collected as part of a UC Ship Funds cruise, which is a program that provides opportunities for graduate students, postdocs, and early career scientists in the University of California system to apply for time on one of the major research vessels that's run by the University National Laboratory System that controls all of the oceanographic research vessels that can go out and do this large ocean class work. These ocean vessels are scheduled years to months in advance. So it's really challenging to try to plan a research cruise that needs to be scheduled for months to years at the same time as we are unable to predict when a wildfire might happen because that wildfire is inevitably going to be extremely uncertain. In this case, we had a serendipitous situation where previously timed research cruises at sea lined up with the Thomas Fire, which was happening adjacent to the Santa Barbara Channel. So we already had the opportunity to go out on a research vessel, collect a lot of different samples, and we decided to look at these impacts of wildfire smoke and ash on the phytoplankton community by collecting seawater samples. So Erin talked a bit about using satellite data, and I wanted to show you an example of how powerful a satellite can be for observing the effects and the extent of a wildfire. So we have this image of the Santa Barbara Channel the day before the Thomas Fire started in 2017. You can see some of the Channel Islands right here, and this is the area right here that we're really referring to as the channel. We talk about the Santa Barbara Channel. The next day, after the fire had been burning for about 12 hours, we get this satellite image. So on the bottom of the screen, there are some clouds, and that can be separated from these upper examples of the smoke plume. And you can see from the burning on land, that smoke is going right over the channel and presumably depositing some smoke and ash over the channel where the phytoplankton are living. So this is what it looked like on land. As we were preparing to go out for this research cruise, we were dealing with conditions that are probably familiar to many of you at this point, where we have heavy amounts of smoke and ash in the atmosphere, changing the amount of light. As I talked about before, you can really see how that sunlight looks different, and also just changing the conditions entirely that are overlying the ocean. But what did it actually look like when we were out on the boat? So we had a drone with us that was able to collect some imagery. This is RV Sally Ride, out in the Santa Barbara Channel during the Thomas Fire. And from this view, it almost looks like it was a little bit clearer. You can see the ocean pretty clearly, you can see the ship. But when we actually look at what was falling onto the ship, we did have a lot of deposition of this wildfire ash. And you can see here that it was enough that people could even write in that ash, like, you're writing in a fogged up window on the side of the Sally Ride. And so presumably we know all of that ash that's falling down onto the ship is also falling into the adjacent ocean. So we knew that we did have this wildfire ash deposition. Now our question is, how are all of those changes, that deposited ash, that decrease in light, affecting the phytoplankton community? In order to look at this, we collected some phytoplankton in seawater samples. So we wanted to look at the different types of phytoplankton and how much phytoplankton we had in order to tell us if that was what we would expect for a typical December in the Santa Barbara Channel. We also measured other information that would be useful to try to know how things were changing during the fire, specifically looking at these nutrient concentrations in seawater and the light levels that were available at the surface of the ocean and then going down deeper into the ocean to know what conditions the phytoplankton were experiencing. And what did we find? So we found that there were, in fact, higher nutrient concentrations than we would expect in a typical December in the Santa Barbara Channel, specifically in nitrogen and phosphorus, which are essential nutrients for phytoplankton to use as building blocks. But we found similar light levels to the non-fire conditions, which was slightly surprising to us at first, given how much the light that was reaching the ship and that we could see with our eyes was changed. But the actual amount of light, the number of photons reaching the surface of the ocean, did not meaningfully change from typical conditions. We also found an increase in the amount of phytoplankton. We found that there were more phytoplankton than we would have expected and different types than are typical for a December in the Santa Barbara Channel. But as Erin mentioned, it's not always straightforward to look at environmental change on just one axis. So we also found that we had a warmer ocean than we expected during this time. The ocean off the coast of California was warmer in 2017 than was expected for the month and those conditions across the whole coast. And so we found that the conditions in the Santa Barbara Channel were anomalously warm, which was similar to other locations across the coast of California and was unrelated to the Thomas Fire because those warm conditions started before the fire, lasted through its extent, and were also found after the fire. Now, I've been saying a lot that these conditions were different from a typical December. How do we know that that's the case? We were using information from long-term time series data. So time series programs are monitoring environmental change over time. They're collecting a similar suite of measurements at a similar interval over the years to try to see how an ecosystem might be changing. And in this case, during the Thomas Fire, we were able to rely on this ecosystem. The Thomas Fire ecosystem in the Santa Barbara Channel had a long-term monitoring series called the Plumes and Blooms time series that had been collecting data since 1996. So we have a great record to look back at that time series and see that it was different. And that's how we know that we had different conditions. We also could monitor how our phytoplankton conditions were different using this network of instruments called the Imaging Flow Cytobot, or IFCB. And you can see all of these different IFCBs. There's this network along the coast of California that's been put together with a lot of support from a lot of different funding agencies to get a sense of which phytoplankton are where. By using this same instrument, we were able to compare our results in the Santa Barbara Channel to results in other ecosystems and see if they also had different conditions during warmer periods. But now we can also use this data during wildfires when it might be difficult to go out and collect samples. So the main points here are many things that you've heard from the other two speakers already. We know that the impact of fires on the ocean are still very uncertain, and they vary between ecosystems and fires. So it's important to continue monitoring these effects across different ecosystems and different fires, because we've already found different effects between different systems and different fires. And we don't know if future fires will even match the ones that we've already been able to sample in the past. So having this continued sampling, the ability to get out into the field, collect these samples, and answer the questions that we're asking about how the ecosystem is changing is essential. By using this time series data, like these two examples that I showed you of Plumes and Blooms and the IFCB network, we're also able to have ongoing monitoring because it's difficult to predict when a wildfire might occur and respond to that wildfire. So we can rely on these coastal time series to give us a sense of the conditions before, during, and after the fire, particularly if the fire itself makes it difficult or hazardous to access the ocean and sample during these crucial extreme events. So I mentioned at the beginning, this work was supported by a lot of different people and funding agencies, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of these different sources, particularly trying to mobilize this work on a short time scale. We were very, very lucky to get support from a lot of different agencies and a lot of different programs, and many different people as well. And then my final plug, and I'll also put this in the chat as well. We had 3 artists who came to sea with us during this research cruise, and the products that they were able to create add this different angle to the scientific results that I showed you today. And I would really encourage you to take a look at some of the work that they produced, because I think that's an essential way to bridge this gap between science and the broader public, is getting the involvement of people who got to experience this with us and who process this information in such a different way. Thank you so much for your attention today, and I'm very happy to turn the stage over now to Dr. Julie Dinesque. Julie's going to talk to you a bit about some of these time series and recent observations during the LA fires.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the organizer for having me today. And I would like to really thank the 3 previous panelists for setting the scene so well. So now I'm going to move to very recent and tragic events in Los Angeles earlier this year and discuss the potential impact on California coastal Pacific Ocean. So on January 7th, 2025, different fire broke over the city of Los Angeles with devastating impact on the city. These urban fires are different from what we have heard earlier from the previous panelist, while they burned built infrastructure compared to forest fires that were previously described. So these fires burned built people homes, businesses, cars, and they really burned very close to the coast. And the fire smoke was pushed very far at sea, also through the Santa Ana wind. So these fires brought far offshore into the Pacific Ocean potentially toxic cocktail of ash and debris into our coastal ecosystem. So luckily, at the time of the LA fire, a cruise of scientists, a little bit like Sasha described for the Thomas fire, this was complete coincidence. We're doing a survey of the coastal California ecosystem. And so these scientists really witnessed firsthand the impact of this fire and the deposition of debris on the surface of the ocean. So I just want to tell you briefly about CalCOFI. So these scientists were part of the CalCOFI survey. CalCOFI is a long-term monitoring program that has for mission to really understand the dynamic of the California coastal marine ecosystem since 1949. So this is the longest running monitoring program for marine ecosystem in the world. And so CalCOFI researchers and associated monitoring program monitor a wide range of parameters to really understand this coastal ecosystem, ranging from physical oceanography, physical parameter, marine chemistry, and marine biology. And here you can really see CalCOFI scientists that are recovering a plankton net. Sasha told us a little bit about plankton, but here I just want you to remember this image and the color of these nets. So why do we care about this long-term monitoring program? As Sasha mentioned, it provides this baseline record, which is really essential to understand the short to long-term impact from these extreme events, such as wildfire. And this in turn support coastal and marine resource management. So early in January, the CalCOFI team left San Diego to do their regular survey, going from San Diego and making their way north. So here you can see the grid from CalCOFI winter survey. So they went from San Diego going up north And as they got closer to Los Angeles, they really started to see this plume of smoke in the sky. And going even closer, they started really to smell the smoke, and they describe it as smelling like burned electronic material, very different than what you would expect from a vegetation fire, for instance. And as they made their way close to Santa Monica, and here you can see the station that were very impacted from these little clouds, they started really recovering on the surface of this ocean actual ash debris from the fires. So they were able to really change and adapt their collection to take more samples so we could later understand the impact of these Los Angeles fires on the marine ecosystem. And so this is what they saw. So here is a plankton net recovered from close to Santa Monica during the fire event. So I think you remember the very white plankton net. Here we have a plankton net completely stained with ash. On the right here, you can see the ash debris that were recovered from this plankton net, and you can see really the range of debris from very small, probably some microscopic debris as well, to very, very large pieces of burned material. In the middle, you can see these different jars. So that's where we put the plankton sample. We collect them into jars so they can be preserved over time. And so the jar on the left is a jar closer to Santa Monica, going all the way to 100 miles offshore from the fire. They kept recovering little debris from these fires. And you can really see the difference of this gradient of debris recovered. Of course, there was more close to the fire. But this is what a plankton sample should look like in a regular sea. You should be able to see, like Sasha showed us, this small zooplankton shrimp-like organism, not recovering all these very big ash debris. So where do we go from there? So we got, thanks really to CalCoffee, this would not have been possible to CalCoffee's effort. We have a lot of samples from this fire. And then we continued monitoring the region in collaboration with LA City and LA County Sanitation District. And so what do we do with all these samples? What do we want to understand? So first, we really need to understand this potential toxic cocktail. What is entering this ocean? What are these ash and debris made of? Is it potential, all these pollutants, heavy metal, are they toxic for marine organisms? Are they toxic for public health? And how long do they persist in the environment? The other question is also to know, like, where does it spread? Where did it go from there? So during the fire, all these debris were spread through smoke. You see from the satellite imaging, all this smoke plume going all around the region into the ocean. After the fire, some of this debris, and we've heard that also from Erin, can be spread through runoff. So with all the very strong precipitation we got after the fire, we had a lot of runoff of debris into the coastal ecosystem that can then move around through currents. So where do they go? How long do they persist? And how long does it take for this contaminant to seep into the ecosystem, into the watershed, and make their way to the coast? And then we can really ask the question, so what is the impact for the marine ecosystem? What is the impact for ecosystem health, for the iconic California marine organisms? How toxic are these compounds? How toxic are these compounds for beach access, for people, for public health and public safety? And also, we heard from Sasha, they have impact on the phytoplankton, but this contaminant from the phytoplankton, from the microorganisms, can make their way and accumulate into the fish we eat over time. And so what is the potential impact of this potentially very toxic cocktail on food safety? And overall, what is the impact of this fire on coastal economy as well? So we've heard from the different panelists, there's so many questions. This is such a complex system, a complex environment, and we have urban fires that add an extra complexity to the forest fires that have been studied earlier. And so for that, we really need a lot of people to come together and continue monitoring the system to understand the impact. So thanks to SCWRPS and the California Water Board, and this is a monitoring group that is coordinated by Dr. Mehinto at SCWRP, a lot of agencies monitoring this fire were brought together really to form the post-fire monitoring work group for aquatic habitat. And this work group comprise over 25 agencies that are monitoring over 200 sites around the Los Angeles area, so sites inland for the watershed, also coastal sites, and we are monitoring the more ocean sites. And so this group is going to be able to centralize all the data to better understand the impact on this fire and to better inform people on water quality, to quality control all this data, and then provide it back to the community. So going back to all these different case studies we've heard about from the previous panelists and from this Los Angeles, so where do we go from there? And how do we build a framework to understand future fire risk on coastal ecosystem? So again, this is a very, very complex question. We need a transdisciplinary framework, bringing together researchers, and we've heard about it's researchers from different disciplines, going from land to sea, marine, chemists, modelers, and also health agencies, conservation agencies, and stakeholders to really be able to better understand the impact on marine ecosystem, but also and inform the public health and the better management of this fire. As we've heard also from Sasha, and we really need the continuity of this long-term ecosystem monitoring program to provide this baseline, but also to provide the data for the long-term impact of these extreme events. Like how long are these impacts gonna last and to which extent? And then what we were very lucky here, and Sasha was also very lucky to have crews at sea, and we've heard it's very difficult to have the infrastructure to really study this extreme event. And so we need fast response capacity to understand the immediate impact of these extreme events and also to understand the runoff impact, so a little bit after impact and short-term impact of this event to be able to gather all this perishable data and samples. So we really expect to have more data to inform the community in the next few months. But again, this is a very complex system. And so there's a lot of different pieces to the puzzle. So, and I would like to thank everybody that has been helping us to monitor the system and take data, and particularly CalCoffee. And so I'm bringing it back to Lauren. Thank you, Lauren.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie, Douglas, Erin, and Sasha for those really fantastic talks. You got into a lot of great overview and detail. So now we are going to move into a moderated Q&A for the remainder of our time, and we do have until 11:15 Pacific for our Q&A. A reminder to those in the audience, if you haven't already submitted a question in the Q&A box, please do. And we're receiving a ton of great questions now. We received a ton of questions in the lead up to this, so we'll do our best to kind of summarize and get through as many topics as we can. But I did ask the speakers, and they are generously willing to share their email addresses as well for any follow-up. So great, thank you all for coming back. So I wanted to start by asking a bit more of an overarching question that hasn't come in from the audience, but that I think will help us understand sort of how to put all of this together. So we heard from each of you about your really important research findings from past wildfires and the current fires, but also that there are major gaps in our understanding of wildfire impacts on ocean and coastal health. So I'd love to hear from each of you, from your perspective, what specific measurements and tools are needed to effectively study wildfire impacts on ocean health, maybe that we don't currently utilize, and maybe tying it into what larger science infrastructure investments or tools would be most beneficial to this field. Great. Would anybody like to take that question first?
I can take a whack at it. I'll do my best with my personal perspective on it. I think that it's such a great question, and it also is a challenging one to answer because I think, as you've all heard today, there are so many different facets of the ecosystem that might be and probably are affected by a coastal wildfire. And given that many of us are conducting science with limited resources, whether that's money or time or access to a research vessel or all of the above, it's difficult to be able to possibly sample everything in one study, even if you have the time to plan that well ahead of a wildfire. And so, for my personal research interests, I would love to get a better characterization of the phytoplankton community, who is there, the amount of phytoplankton, these kind of essential other pieces of the ecosystem, like the nutrient concentrations and the light levels that I talked about today. But then, as soon as that piece maybe has a little bit more information, the connections between the phytoplankton community and these other parts of the ecosystem also become a question, right? And so if I advocate for putting all of the resources that I have behind those measurements at the expense of a different type of measurement, maybe some larger organisms or even some smaller organisms. Erin talked about bacteria today, which is hugely important for thinking about impacts on the ocean and on human health as well. And so it's sometimes challenging as an oceanographer to say, like, yes, just this one thing, because the ecosystem is so complex. And I think it's difficult for me, at least, to choose kind of something essential without missing some other pieces of it. So I can answer for my own interests, but I guess my broader answer is I wish we could sample everything, and that's often not a possibility because of our limitations.
I'll just jump in here. I think I agree with Dr. Kramer, and I think that there is no one tool or method or measurement that's going to get us the answers that we need. Each one of these techniques is designed to answer a component of what is happening in the Earth system. And as we heard from Dr. Hamilton, it is complex and multifaceted and more related than we know. And we've seen comments in the chat about ecology is really messy, right? And I think that the one thing that's come out, and we've seen comments in the chat in the Q&A about this as well, is the value of long-term monitoring. And that's across multiple different platforms. And so we wouldn't have known the effects of wildfire ash and atmospheric deposition on carbon sequestration if we didn't have those long-term satellite records that allowed us to track ocean responses over time. If we didn't have the Plumes and Blooms cruises, we wouldn't understand what the effects are on the Santa Barbara Channel. And so it's a hard pill to swallow to invest in long-term monitoring because it is costly, but that investment pays dividends over time, as I think you've seen through the many different scientific questions that are able to be pursued through that long-term monitoring.
I could just add here a little bit extra as well. So I absolutely agree with what my fellow colleagues are saying here. Data, 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 need more data always. And it's always an ask, I think, for any science that we talk about. But just due to the complexity, so I'm an atmospheric scientist, so I'm often on a slightly different spectrum than actually from the ocean side of it. But I really feel like as well, it's not just the way that we're doing the science, the data we're getting for the science, but the way we're doing the science. And it's such a complex question. I feel like one of the real needs is to bring together expertise across different disciplines. Complex questions require multifaceted, different styles of people coming to the table and all offering their own perspective so we can start to piece apart some of these important components. And not just more science, but also a revolution in the way that we're doing that science. So we're getting that holistic viewpoint, I think is also really important for something like this.
Yeah, and I will add one layer out of that. Is like it's really hard to bring everybody in the same room most of the time. We always, especially for researcher, we do our research on our side. But we see it like with the coordination effort from SQUARE to be able to work with all these health agencies and all these conservation agencies to really be able to also inform the public as well. So to bring the researcher and health agencies and hold the different research in the same room together.
Thank you all. Those were great answers. I loved how they built on each other. And with these big collaborations like the one we're seeing, funded by OPC, hosted at SQUIRP, where can the public, access some of this information? Julie, did you mention how these results will be communicated to the public?
Yeah, so they're working on making a centralized website, which will be probably shared through the California Water Board and the different LA health agencies and SQUIRP, showing all the map of the different monitoring stations, all the parameters that are being measured by the different agency, and then as they trickle in the data on all the water quality coming in.
Okay, wonderful. If that website is ready to share, we can make sure we get that out to the audience at some point. It seems like a really engaged group here who wants to stay up on the latest science. Great. So we also received a number of questions related to public health and human impacts of the recent LA wildfires. But given your all expertise and the focus of this webinar, I'd like to ask this more from the standpoint of current research efforts or what we might expect to find on things like water quality and contaminants and biological effects. So maybe starting with Julie and sort of what we're seeing in terms of contaminants or expecting. I think you talked about this some, but is there more you want to say on, contaminants from this wildfire, such as heavy metals, and maybe Douglas, what do we know from maybe other urban fires, given these really were unprecedented urban fires with new types of contaminants entering the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I mean, there's not a lot of data yet, and we want to be sure that we are providing quality data to the public. But yeah, we are all measuring like heavy metals, potential pHs, forever chemicals, plastics, asbestos, all the different potential contaminants coming from the built infrastructure that we could expect would be brought into the ecosystem.
So just say that you're right. The LA fire is unprecedented. We don't really have another data set like that. LA being such the second largest metropolitan area, and it was an absolutely devastating occurrence of fire. So there isn't really anything else to compare to, but we do have an indication of what we might expect from a natural wildfire in terms of the magnitude of those emissions. We're not going to be seeing some of these things like asbestos, although there may well be some contaminants actually still present in the natural system, either through things like mining activities, leaching out into the forests. So the forests themselves become a fingerprint or a marker for the environment around them. And actually, some trees can actually contain high amounts of lead, and that can be traced back, for example, to leaded gasoline. So back from decades ago, where that gasoline, the fumes from the cars is actually then being encapsulated within that built environment. So there is potential for toxicity within natural fires as well, but the urban wildfire is going to be enhanced so much more, still because of that built-in environment. But it really is unprecedented, and we need to learn as much as we can from this.
And Erin, you mentioned that after past fires, you've seen fecal coliform in the water too. Is that something that is being looked into for these recent fires, or would we expect that given the urban nature?
Yes, I think maybe a lot of people don't realize how much of Malibu is on septic. And so I think that we are going to continue to see similar contamination events and maybe even more severe. And I think that that's certainly something that we want to keep an eye on. And I think that a lot of the agencies here on this webinar, for example, I see the city of Los Angeles does long-term monitoring, as does UCLA, as well as non-governmental organizations like surf riders that keep an eye on these things in timely fashion for the public. It's important, I think, for us to coordinate these efforts to ensure that we are getting timely information out to the public. I think that we will see long-term consequences to wildlife health and human health. There's very interesting research that was done about a decade ago out of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute that showed elevated immune responses and depressed immune responses from sea otters that had been exposed to just natural ash and contaminants that made their way into Monterey Bay. And those have legacy effects in terms of the health of a population for an entire generation. And I think we can, again, take a lesson from those natural systems and assume that at a minimum, we will be seeing similar effects and potentially much more toxic and much more deadly to both wildlife and reasonably, unfortunately, maybe some people as well.
And I know we're also seeing a major harmful algal bloom and domoic acid event happening in Southern California. Maybe Sasha, given your phytoplankton research, is there any correlation between wildfire ash or runoff and domoic acid events? Could there be a link here?
Yeah, it's
Or
a
how can
great
we study that?
question. Yeah, absolutely. No, and I completely understand. And, I think everybody who's asking that question is really thinking like a scientist, right? Because that's the type of question that we're wondering as well, is we see a major environmental disturbance, and then shortly after that, we're having another massive ecological disturbance. Are those two things linked to one another? And I think the challenging thing is that the answer might be difficult to figure out. And so the information that we have right now and all of the data that's being collected, including from these long-term monitoring programs, will be really essential for analyzing this specific bloom right now. So what we're seeing right now is this bloom of a specific diatom called Pseudonychia that produces this toxin domoic acid. And when animals, especially farther up the food chain, consume lots of little krill and zooplankton who have been eating these phytoplankton that are expressing that toxin, then it bioaccumulates in those larger marine mammals. And so if you've seen, whether you've been walking on the beach or reading the news, these images of marine mammals that are behaving strangely or that unfortunately have died or are extremely sick and wash up on the shore, that's because of this kind of poisoning from a harmful algal bloom. And so when I talked before about our interest in being able to know which phytoplankton are where, it's something exactly like this that makes it so important to be able to monitor on a really, really specific level, down to the species level in this case, because we know it's one specific type of phytoplankton that's causing this bloom and having these effects. The harder question to answer, we can see that this bloom is happening. We know that these effects are happening on the marine mammals, but is that directly linked to the fire? And I think it will take more time and more research and trying to look at all of this information that we have from programs like Cow Coffee, where they're measuring that information about the nutrient concentrations, about the other things that are in the water. We know that these harmful algal blooms of this specific type of phytoplankton happen periodically in California, but that question of, is it linked to the wildfire? Is it this specific disturbance that created the right conditions in the environment for that phytoplankton group to bloom? That's the type of question that's going to take longer amounts of research to figure out, and these prolonged monitoring programs really make that possible. And I mentioned in my talk this network of imaging flow cytobots, or IFCBs. I'll put in the chat a link so you can actually see their monitoring in real time. And you can look and see these phytoplankton cells, the specific ones that are causing this harmful bloom, in some of these sensors in Southern California. But you can also see them in the different IFCBs that are in Northern or Central California that aren't having a bloom event. So that's another tricky thing, is that sometimes these phytoplankton are present in the environment all the time, but they're not producing these toxins. Sometimes they're present, but in super low concentrations, so they're not affecting the marine mammals. So this type of specific monitoring where we can say, okay, it's a bloom, it's reached this toxin level, we're really worried about this situation, is just so important and irreplaceable in our environment.
I would just want to add a little bit about that. So as Erin mentioned, there's a SCOOS monitoring program monitoring all the harmful algae bloom along the coast that's providing data on all these blooms. And while we cannot dismiss that this bloom may have been affected by some of the nutrient provided by the fire, this is not an unprecedented event for the time and the region. But we cannot say that some of the fire nutrients may have heightened the toxicity of some of these bloom around Malibu or anything. But yeah, as Sasha mentioned, once again, this is very, very complex and it will be difficult to untangle all the different parameters.
Great, thank you. Looking at the clock, I'd love to try to squeeze in one more question. So if we could answer it quickly, that would be great. Just on the topic of sort of potential downstream human impacts of these wildfires along the coast, Douglas, you had mentioned that the role of community engagement and social science in your research or this research in general. How should California coastal communities affected by the fires be engaged to understand these impacts and, getting a sense for effects on coastal communities and businesses like aquaculture and fishing and ecotourism?
I will preface that I'm not from California to start, so I don't know the agencies through which that should actually be doing it. It might be a better question for somebody actually within California to answer that question. So I'm going to offer it up first of all to see if somebody else wants to answer that.
Maybe I'll
Otherwise,
ask.
the answer would be
Go ahead.
scientists can work with agencies. There are, for example, harmful algal blooms. So over here in North Carolina, where I am, we have portals, for example, for harmful algal bloom reporting. So the citizen science is very important. So citizens, if they see the potential for harmful algal blooms occurring in their local environment, they can report that up on a portal. So creating these avenues to engage with communities so that people are becoming partners with science, and then scientists can come in and evaluate the risk and the danger that may be present within that. Are we seeing degraded water quality, for example, or not? So it's about creating those partnerships. And when we're talking about creating community partnerships, this is not something that can be rushed as well. It takes time. It takes trust. It has to be evolved in collaboration with the communities that we wish to work with. And there is no quick solution, I believe, to doing good community engagement. It's a process that requires time and understanding from all parties.
Great, thank you. I would love everyone else to respond, but given the time, maybe we'll see if there is any follow-up from the other researchers, opportunities to engage the public through their specific research. So with that, I'd really like to give a huge thank you again to our fantastic panelists for their time and expertise, and for all of the audience members here. This has been a really educational briefing. There's so much more for us to learn. And thank you again to our sponsors, Senator Allen and Assemblymember Irwin, for your sponsorship and support. A recording of this will be posted to our website that we put in the chat. And then also we'll be sharing the contact information. And I wanted to just, thank the panelists again. You all are welcome to turn off your videos and sign off. And please follow up with Ocean Science Trust if you have any other questions. Thank you all again and take care.